Hello and welcome back to another video of the Brainy Heart. In this video, we will be talking about the prefrontal cortex. Prefrontal cortex is one of two major cortices found in the frontal lobe. The other cortex would be the motor cortex, which I already did a video on. Be sure to check it out here. Without further ado, I present to you the prefrontal cortex. Your prefrontal cortex is located anterior or in front of the motor cortex, and this would be your prefrontal cortex. And if that's the prefrontal cortex, your motor cortex would be somewhere over here. And obviously, by the name prefrontal cortex, it's in the frontal lobe. And the prefrontal cortex can also be called the PFC for short. So your prefrontal cortex can be divided up into 5 different regions, and each of these regions are present in both the right and left hemisphere. So the first region, not in any specific order, is the dorsomedial PFC or prefrontal cortex. And then we have the ventromedial PFC. This looks like one full region, but if we draw a line, this would be the border between the left and right hemispheres. So there's actually 2 of the ventromedial PFCs. And then you have the orbitofrontal PFC. And then you have the ventrolateral PFC, which is over here. And then finally, we have the dorsolateral PFC. So those are the 5 major regions of the prefrontal cortex. Later in this video, I'll be talking about the functions of these specific regions. Now, so these divisions and the functions of these regions are not fully agreed upon by every single neurologist. So later in this video, I'll be talking about the functions of these regions as far as I've researched them. So stay tuned to learn more about these regions in detail. But now I want to talk about the PFC as a whole, the main functions of the PFC. So your PFC, or your prefrontal cortex, takes care of quote-unquote executive functions. There's not a exact definition of executive function, but some of them include attention giving, actions, and emotions, or control of attention, control of actions, and the control of emotions. So this might include planning the future, organization and multitasking, impulse control, the ability to concentrate and gate out distractions, and things like this. Some other functions include thinking about thinking, remembering about remembering, and judgment and understanding. And these are called metacognitive functions of the PFC. And your PFC also has one other major function. It helps you think for yourself. You see, if you didn't have a PFC, then you won't be able to think for yourself. If someone says, go jump off a cliff, if you have a PFC, then you won't do it because you'll die. But if you didn't have a PFC, you can't think for yourself. So you're gonna obey what the person says, and you're gonna go jump off a cliff and die. So your PFC makes you think for yourself, and that's really important because you should never just follow anyone's orders. You should think about what they're saying and then do it if it feels right to you. And your PFC, if damaged, can cause schizophrenia, bipolar disease, major depression disorders, autism, Alzheimer's, cognitive competence, cognitive problems related to Parkinson's disease, etc. So your prefrontal cortex is a very, very important part of the brain that will help you with whatever you're doing. Like if you have to concentrate on something, maybe you're doing homework and you don't want to get distracted by YouTube, your prefrontal cortex is working really hard, even though there are other parts trying to go against the prefrontal cortex. But the prefrontal cortex is trying to get you to work on your homework and be concentrated and get out all the distractions like YouTube. And it also controls your impulse so that you don't get too angry, and anger is very bad for you. Now let's talk about the specific
functions of the regions.
So first, I want to talk about the dorsolateral PFC. Dorsolateral PFC regulates your external world. Dorsolateral PFC regulates our attention and actions so that they are appropriate to the task at hand. Some of the functions of the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex are memory, abstract reasoning, top-down regulation of attention and actions, planning and organization, and insight and judgment. So your dorsolateral prefrontal cortex receives information about the outside world from the auditory and visual cortex. The auditory cortex, as the name suggests, takes care of information that comes in from your ears, and the visual cortex takes care of information from the eyes. These are the two ways that your dorsolateral prefrontal cortex can get information about the outside world and what's happening. That was the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. In contrast to the dorsolateral PFC, which regulates the external world, the ventromedial and orbitofrontal PFC regulate your inner state, so your emotions and things like that. And fun fact, the reason why we call this region the orbitofrontal PFC is because both these regions sit on top of the orbits of your eyes. So hence the name orbito, and then frontal meaning at the front, orbitofrontal PFC. But coming back to the functions, so your orbitofrontal PFC actually takes care of creating flavor. So how it does this is that it takes information from the olfactory bulbs, which are parts of the brain that get sensory information about the taste and smell of things around you, and then the olfactory bulb send it to other parts of the brain as well, but one part is the orbitofrontal PFC, and then the orbitofrontal PFC takes the taste and the smell, puts them together, and creates flavor. And it might consider something as disgusting and something else as wonderful. So if you're a person that hates broccolis, that means your PFC is classifying this, is putting together the taste and smell of the broccoli together and creating a flavor. And this flavor, according to the PFC, or the orbitofrontal PFC, is a bad flavor, which causes you to dislike the taste and smell of broccoli. Now let's talk about the ventromedial PFC. Your ventromedial PFC gets info from the limbic lobe, also known as limbic information. This information contains emotions and pain inputs and stuff like that. So that was the function of the ventromedial PFC. The next region that I want to talk about is the dorsomedial PFC, which is right here. The dorsomedial PFC plays a very major role in your emotions. So it regulates your emotions and it decides on what emotion you should have at a given point. And it also creates emotions or generates emotions. So that was the dorsomedial PFC, and that's all I could find when I was researching. But I'm sure there's a lot more scholarly articles on this topic. So if you're really passionate, you might want to check that out if you really want to go deep into this topic. But that was just a very, very brief overview of the function.
So, in summary, your prefrontal cortex is basically the government of your body. Just like every country has its own government, your body's government is the prefrontal cortex.
Just like each government defines how the country is and how other people think of the country, let's say the US government is known for being a very good government and taking care of its country. Hence, USA as a whole is regarded as a very good nation. While other countries where there's a lot of corruption and bribery, the governments are not so good. And hence, those countries as a whole are regarded as bad. So, I guess that's how your prefrontal cortex is. So the prefrontal cortex is basically defining you as a person, in my opinion. although there are other parts of your brain that also do that. But your frontal lobe and mainly your prefrontal cortex is basically defining who you are as a person. In regards to functions, the government has very similar functions that has to do to keep country running, and just like that, your prefrontal cortex has very similar functions to the government to keep your body running. So these executive functions are done by the government in regards to a country, and in the human body, it's done by the frontal lobe and the prefrontal cortex mainly. That was just a quick overview, and I wanted to provide an analogy so that you can remember the prefrontal cortex and its functions. So that was it for today's video. I hope you enjoyed it and learned from it. I'm always open to comments, questions, and or suggestions. This is the Brainy Heart signing off. I'll catch you later in the next video.